We're going to begin a series this morning entitled Scandalous Stories about a Scandalous God. Most of the time, when you take time to read through the Gospels, you're going to find that an awful lot, especially in Matthew, Mark, Luke includes a fair number of them, but Matthew and Mark particularly, of stories that Jesus told, parables. And a lot of times we read those parables, and as we'll see in a minute, because we're so familiar with a lot of them, especially a few of them we're very familiar with, we miss some of the shock value of what Jesus is actually talking about. And probably the most famous of the stories that Jesus tells is the story of the prodigal son. But what we're going to be talking about this morning and probably next week, because this is probably going to be a two-parter, is are we really talking about a prodigal son or about a prodigal God? Now, Jesus, when he was in this setting, one of the things that Luke, and of course he does include this one, tells us at the beginning of the 15th chapter, where this story is included in Jesus' teachings, he talks about tax collectors and sinners, the two worst groups of people in Jewish society, the two most hated groups of people many times, especially the tax collectors, by the religious people of Jewish society. Sinners were irreligious Jews. They didn't care anything about Torah. They didn't care anything about God. That's how they were considered. They lived life the way they wanted to. They didn't try to keep the commandments or anything like that, and they lived very crazy, loose, wild lives. Tax collectors were traitors to their country. But it says that they were all coming near to him to listen to him. Something was unique about this message he was talking about, this kingdom, this gospel. And it says the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling, saying, this man receives. He's embracing. He's welcoming. He's taking in among himself sinners, tax collectors. He eats with them. Remember, as we've talked about in the past, fellowship around a meal was a very serious business. This was saying, I'm your friend. I'm committed to you. I welcome you into my circle. You're welcome here. And so it was an extension of saying, I want a relationship with you. And Jesus was embracing these kinds of people. And then it was in this setting that Jesus told three specific parables. The most famous, as I said, the one that he closes with from verses 11 through 32 of the prodigal son. So as he's rolling along telling these stories, one about the lost coin, one about the lost sheep, and then he comes to this one about, which we have entitled, the lost son. And again, we can be swayed sometimes by these little headings above our passages in Scripture to give us sort of, okay, he's talking about the lost son here. Well, actually, no, he's really not. Because there's two lost sons in this story, not one. And then you've got the God who's being pictured here where the real focus is supposed to be at, as it is in every one of Jesus' parables. The ultimate focus is his Father. And so as he starts this, he said to them, a certain man had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give my share of your property. And he divided his livelihood between them. Not many days after that, the younger son gathered all this together, and he traveled into a far country, and there he wasted his property with prodigal living. And when he had spent all of it, there arose a severe famine in that country, and he began to be in need. Well, then he went and joined himself to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed pigs. And he wanted to fill his belly with the husks or the pods that the pigs ate, but no one even gave him any. But when he came to himself, he said, how many hired servants of my father's have bread enough to spare, and I am dying with hunger? I'll get up and go to my father, and I'll tell him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I'm no more worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him. He was moved with compassion, and he ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring out the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. Bring fattened calf, kill it. Let's eat and let's celebrate. For this my son was dead, and he's alive again. He was lost, and he's found. Well, they began to celebrate. Well, his elder son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants to him and said, "What's going on?" He said to him, "Oh, your brother's come. Your father's killed a fattened calf because he has received him back safe and healthy." But he was angry and wouldn't go in. Therefore his father came out and begged him. But he answered his father, "Behold, these many years I have served you. I've never disobeyed a commandment of yours, but you never even gave me a goat that I might celebrate with my friends. For this your son came, who has devoured your living with prostitutes. You killed the fattened calf for him." And he said to him, "Son, you're always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But it was appropriate to celebrate and be glad. For this your brother was dead, and he's alive again. He was lost, and now he's found." And that's how the story ends. It's interesting that it ends that way, and we'll see why in a minute. The word prodigal is interesting how it's associated with this. It's not, it was used once in the passage about prodigal living, but it's an adjective. And it is used to describe anyone who kind of takes money, resources, or anything and uses them kind of in a reckless, extravagant kind of way, often to the point of wastefulness, where, you're just being crazy with what you've got and you're wasting it, just spreading it out all over the place. But it's really associated with the whole extravagant aspect of whatever the material possession may be that's being distributed. That's why in this parable, we need to understand, are we really talking about a prodigal son, or are we talking about a prodigal God who is extravagant with what he's offering, to the point of where it appears to religious people wasteful of what he is offering to humanity who has found itself in the far country and lost. Parables are interesting tools that Jesus used when he was out with the people. Robert Capon, one of my favorite authors I've mentioned so many times here, he wrote a book years ago entitled Kingdom, Grace, Judgment, a look at the parables of Jesus. And as he starts that book, he says, a book, quote, about the parables of Jesus faces two obstacles at the outset. The first and more troublesome, oddly enough, is familiarity. Most people, on reading the Gospel's assertion that Jesus spoke in parables, assume they know exactly what is meant. Oh, yes, they say. And a wonderful teaching device it was, too. All those unforgettable stories we're so fond of, like the Good Samaritan and the Prodigal Son. Yet their enthusiasm is very narrowly based. Jesus' use of parabolic method can hardly be limited to just a mere handful of instances they remember as entertaining, agreeable, simple, or clear. Some of his parables are not stories. Many are not agreeable. Most are very complex, and a good percentage of them produce more confusion than understanding. Most of this book, therefore, will be devoted to the removal of the obstacles of the too facile familiarity. Jesus spoke in strange, bizarre, disturbing ways. He balked at almost no comparison, however irreverent or unrefined. Apparently, he found nothing odd about holding up as a mirror to God's ways a mixed bag of questionable characters: an unjust judge, a savage king, a tipsy slave owner, an unfair employer, and even a man who gives help only to bona fide priests or pests. Furthermore, Jesus not only spoke in parables, he thought in parables. He acted in parables. He regularly insisted that what he was proclaiming could not be set forth in any other way than in parables. He was practically an ambulatory parable in and of himself. He cursed fig trees, walked on water, planted coins in fishes' mouths, and for his final act, sailed up into a cloud. In John, we read, "No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has said the last word about him." Only Jesus apparently, is the full revelation of what God is and does. Any notions we come up with are always partial, frequently misleading, and sometimes completely off the mark. When we see these terms like parables, and it says, and Jesus gave them this parable, we begin to think, well, what is a parable? Well, this is something of a teaching method that was very familiar to the common people of Jesus' day. It was a rabbinical teaching method that had been in practice for eons among the Jewish leaders and the Jewish religious teacher. And what happens in a parable is that the reality or some reality of God is intended to be revealed to people. They taught, Jesus, along with the other rabbis, they taught about God by using illustrations that would reach somebody's heart through their imagination. Stories are wonderful to do that, to get you to begin to think, to begin to ponder through some sort of concept or idea. And what they do is they challenge the mind. They confront the mind at a very, high level, and they are simple stories. They're not really complex, deep stories, but they're very simple, and they made common sense out of religious complexities. They took some deep theological thing about God and tried to make it simple. As I've always liked this saying, and that a professor shared with me years ago, you want to be able to take the cookies up here and put them down on the shelf for everybody to be able to eat when you start talking about spiritual realities. Don't keep them way up here in high-sounding theological jargon that nobody understands or can get and makes no difference in their life on Monday morning. Put it down on the bottom shelf. Well, a parable is taking a big concept about God, and it's taking them and putting it down on the shelf where everybody can participate. On the one hand, God is really beyond our human comprehension and our understanding. But then on the other hand, some of that infinite, unending, glorious majesty can be captured in a simple, small story. The Hebrew word for parable is the word mashal. And it's a word that, again, it's sort of complex. It's rich with a lot of different kinds of meaning. The word means to have similarity, to resemble something, and it can be used of any kind of illustration. Sometimes it's referred to, it's used in reference to a fictitious story that's made up. Sometimes it may refer to a proverb or riddle. It could be an anecdote or a fable or an allegory that someone is saying. John Bunyan's great book, The Pilgrim's Progress, could be considered a parable because it's taking spiritual truths about walking with God and the cross and all those things, but put them in a story form that's acted and narrated out. And it's sort of like a flower opening up where you begin to see these deep truths in fresh and beautiful ways about God. But it always ends up being a story about God in some way, and then the human response to God and to His love. The Greek word parabole is very similar to it. And again, it's usually has to do with putting something, here's something, and you take it and you put it beside it to shed light on this over here. So a parable is taking a story that Jesus is saying. He takes a story to shed light on this spiritual truth He's trying to teach people about His Father. And so if John says that Jesus is the one who knows the Father, and He's the only one, nobody else knows the Father like He does. Nobody's ever seen the Father like He's seen Him. So if we want a full revelation of who the Father is and what the Father is like, we can glean some understanding from things as we read through the Old Testament. God's revealing Himself progressively, as it were, through there. But the full, complete revelation of who He is and what He's like is only found in Jesus. And if we want to find out what Dad is like, then we need to look at the Son. And what the Son says, how the Son thinks, how the Son acts. This is how Dad does. This is what Father does. This is how He acts. And so this is what parables do. But again, as we talked about a few weeks back in that series, Lost in Translation, we forget to put ourselves back into the mind of a Jewish person hearing that in the first century. Because they had again, they're not, you and me, 2,000 years removed, trying to compare it to things we know of now. They had an understanding, and again, Jesus used a lot of agricultural, farming, concepts and royal concepts, things like that they were used to, and they were very familiar with. Because again, most of these people, many of them, were very common people. They didn't have great education. They weren't educated like a lot of the more religious people were. They They were very simple people. And so this is where Jesus spent his time with these people. And he was trying to take these truths about his Father and place them on a level that they could wrap their minds around with and understand. And oftentimes, Jesus would take stories that they were already familiar with. And the prodigal son is very similar to several rabbinic parables that the people were already familiar with about family dynamics. But those stories ended and unrolled a little bit differently than how Jesus tells it when he begins to illustrate God and his love for sinful humanity. Jesus is dramatizing for these people a family tragedy. He is focusing on a crisis in this family of broken relationships. Broken relationships between them and their dad, and between themselves, brother and brother. There is a broken relationship. A person living without God, like the younger son, who takes off, runs away to a far country. But the older son, who stays at home with dad, is no better off than the one who ran away. He's very much like the religious person who understands, God in sense, or they think they understand God's divine nature, but they have no meaningful relationship with him. They've got a lot of information up here, but there is not a whole lot that's going on in here between them and God. The elder son, he doesn't show any love for his father, and he struggles. And it's illustrated to us in this story, probably unsuccessfully, to forgive his younger brother. He can't share the joy with his father of his younger brother coming home. The whole plot's built around the father and his two sons. The parable begins with both sons. The parable ends with both sons and the father's relationship with them. A loving father has two boys. Leslie Weatherhead says one of them walled himself off from his father's love by doing evil, while the other one walled himself off from that same love by doing good. In both cases, the sons were prodigals, for they were estranged from their father, and the love relationship between them and him was broken. They did not love their father, and they were not even capable of loving each other. Notice, the one did evil by running away. The other one did evil by running to the good. Remember what tree Adam and Eve ate from in the garden that got them in trouble? The knowledge of the tree of good and evil. What did that knowledge do? It sent Adam running away from God. So one walled himself off doing good. And a lot of people today sit in religious systems who've walled themselves off completely from God and his love because they're doing good. They have no meaningful relationship with the Father at all. Got a lot of information up here. Could teach Bible studies out the wazoo, but they have no intimate relationship with God. Churches are full of them. And then you've got a world that's running away from God. Just running away from him or their concept of God. And whatever concept's been presented to them of God that may be completely off base. Jesus is dramatizing a family conflict. Everybody that he's talking to would be familiar with that. Do you think the prostitutes and the tax collectors who were sitting there listening to him were not familiar with family conflict? Most of them have been kicked out of their families. Most of them have been rejected by their families. Many of them, if they were boys, had lost their inheritance. And they're standing for an inheritance in their family because of their lifestyle. And then, of course, you have the religious guys sitting around there who are judging them and judging Jesus for embracing them. They have no relationship with them at all. They're the ones that were supposed to be showing God to the people, bringing people to God. And yet they were rejecting these people, broke relationships between the two groups. And they had walled themselves up. They had a hard time accepting, conceiving, and embracing God and His love as represented in the person of Jesus, so much so that they eventually participated in plotting to have Him killed. They had walled themselves off from the Father. The elder brother in this story has a problem. As the story unfolds, he is silent. And we'll see why in a minute. His silence speaks louder than anything he says. And at the end of the parable, they're not surprising because he had a responsibility, and we'll see this in a minute, to prevent, as the older son, to prevent the breakup of his family. And all the people listening understood that because he's the older one. He has that responsibility. So in their culture, they understood he's failed in his responsibility to hold the family together. Failed. The younger son reveals his heart. The older son doesn't say anything, and it reveals his heart. The younger son wants his father to die. He wants him dead because he wants his part of the inheritance. And he knew that, unless dad's really generous here, he's got to die before I can get what I want. And he's only going to get a third. The older son's going to get 2/3 of it because the older son, the rights and privileges of birthright. He's only going to get a third. This big landowner, obviously. So the people were familiar with that. And the younger son, here we go. There's shock value to these people. Again, shock value, I want you dead. Again, an inconceivable way to think about your parents as a Jew. The younger son was saying, I want you dead. The elder son, though, quietly gets his little double portion of the inheritance, and he does nothing to bring about reconciliation. Nothing. Neither of them tries to build a relationship with the other, and neither of them tries to have a relationship with the Father. In the first century, and these people are sitting there listening to this story as Jesus is dramatizing this for them. In the first century, a crisis like this in a family would have a listener just on the edge of their seat, kind of riveted, listening to the story because of the shock effect of how Jesus is describing this. Because it's completely contrary to what they all know is proper and right, ethical, and culturally right, religiously right. They know it's off the rails here. So everybody's sitting there listening to this wild, crazy story about these boys and the breakup of their relationship with each other and the Father. You got two different sons who on the outside seem different, but underneath are very much the same. They both need a meaningful relationship with their dad, and neither one of them understands the heart of their father. Neither one of them. Neither one of them. It's got 3 actors. Every one of them plays a significant role. Each of them, the younger son, the older son, and the father, surprise the audience that they're listening to this by their actions and by their words. Everyone in the audience, when they start hearing older son, younger son, father, they already have a cultural expectation of the role of this person. Just like when we hear the term dad, father, in our growing up, we have an understanding. This is how dad does. This is what a father does. This is how they act. Sons, daughters, we have a cultural understanding. They bring this into this. And so all of a sudden, Jesus takes that cultural understanding and he does what? He turns it upside down on its head. So the people are like, whoa. He's got their attention in the story that he's sharing with them. He shocks them. The audience is automatically expecting the elder son to fulfill the role that he's given culturally and religiously to be the family mediator. But he doesn't. He acts completely out of greed. And he becomes a greedy hypocrite. The younger son, they expect, as Jesus is telling the story, he goes to the far country and he starts hearing that, he's starving to death. They expect him to die of starvation rather than him return back to the Father. They would have even understood it better if when the son got back, the father took him and, sort of put him in some sort of punishment. Severe retribution because he'd suffered such abuse from this son of his. But that didn't happen because that was their concept of God. Instead, everybody that's listening is shocked by the compassion of Dad. They're blown away by it. They don't understand it. It's going against everything they've ever understood. All the role reversals makes it a kind of a living play that Jesus is dramatizing in story form for them, that he leads them to embrace this concept and understanding of his Father. Because what parables do is this. What they do is they take those deep things about God, those spiritual things, they put light on it in a simple story form. But what the parable intends to do is not just help you understand, but it's intended to push a person completely in a different direction, to push them out of their comfort zone when it comes to their understanding about God. That's what Jesus is intending. He is pushing people out of their religious comfort zone, out of their concepts of God that are wrong, that are not true, that have never been true, that God is not any different now in Jesus' day as he was represented in the Son than he was when he was on Mount Sinai. He is still the same God. A lot of the things that you had that took place back here in the Old Testament, you got some warped views of my Father, and they developed into things that were just not true. Because again, how Satan develops lies is he takes truth and he warps it. He warps it. And truth at its purest point, when it's 100% absolutely true, when you start twisting it and warping it in the slightest way, it then becomes a lie. And that was what Satan did. Satan took truths that people were being shown about God and his compassion and some of the events, and then he started warping that. He figures, well, I can't get them to rebel and just hate God and walk away, so I'm going to warp their understanding about God to create division among them, to create concepts that will keep them from being close to God, that will keep them at distance from God, because they will think and conceive that God doesn't want them close. God wants them away and at a distance. He's going to keep them at arm's length. Or for a lot of them, he doesn't even want them at all because they're just no good. They're just not worth it. There's a lot wrong in this story. There's a lot wrong with the younger son. He is a rebel to the very core of his being. He is not a submissive son. He's not going to be an obedient son. It's completely unthinkable. It would have been to the people listening to this for that son to ask for his inheritance before his father dies. But even after he does this, to make matters even worse, he sells it all. And then he runs away from his father. Not only does he tell him, I wish that you were dead. But then what you do give me, he takes it and sells it, land. He sells it and then bolts. He leaves and goes away into a far country. His heart is hard. He very much fits the description of the rebellious child in Deuteronomy 21:20, when his parents bring him before the elders of the city and they say, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. Again, people listening to this make the connections. Stubborn, rebellious sons. There's punishment. We go back to Torah. Moses said such a son needed to be judged, so such a son needed to be punished. He's disobedient to the father. He seeks to run away as far away as he can from his father. He defies his father's love. After implying, when he asked him for his inheritance, basically, I said, I just wish you'd drop dead right now. He then takes it, turns all the assets into cash, runs away to a far country. And the idea there is he's running away to a Gentile country. It's far. And everybody understands, when you leave Israel, you're in bad space. He's going to a pagan country. He's going to a Gentile country. He's going outside the boundaries of the land. So all of a sudden, 1/3 of all the family's wealth is liquidated. Gone. He has sold every bit of it. Now, the buyers, whoever it was, and again, it's implied in the story, somebody bought the land from the younger son, took his portion. They could not take possession of the land until the father actually died. It wouldn't be theirs totally and completely legally, and they couldn't do what they wanted to with it until the father died. And they may have got a great deal on it. Son may have given them a great deal, especially because of the special things relating to the sale. They're like, well, we can't possess this yet. You better give it to us at a lower price because your dad's not dead and he might not die for 20 years. We want the land. It's good stuff. So they're buying the land. So they probably got a really good deal. So he takes the money and he travels just as far away from the family as he possibly can. In the Mishnah, the law, the Jewish written law concerning the law of Moses, they summarize this kind of act in the transference of land. One, the son obtains the right of possession. The land in question, for example, cannot be sold now by the father. So because the son's now possessed it because it's been given, his 1/3. But he doesn't acquire the right of disposal if the son sells the property. The purchaser can only take possession upon the death of the father. And then 3, he does not acquire rights. The person who buys it doesn't acquire the right to use and enjoy the thing possessed directly or without altering it, which remains in the father's unrestricted possession until his death. So they had this concept. Again, Jesus is telling the story, and the people in their day, they already understood how this all works. And they're thinking, okay, he's selling the land. They can't take possession of it. We understand all that. His father's still got to die, but he's already taken the money and he's run. He's left home. He's violated Torah. He's a rebellious, hard-hearted son. The father, though, doesn't just give the younger son his 1/3. He goes ahead and gives the older son his 2/3. And the older son quietly receives it while the younger son converts it all to money, takes off. And of course, kind of like It's a Wonderful Life and George Bailey, the younger son is like George. He wants to leave Bedford Falls and get out of town and travel. He wants to see the world like many young people want to do. They want to get away from home and go out and see what's out in this wide, wide world and leave the family far behind. He takes his money, travels to the faraway country. He wastes it all very, very quickly. And then, like many runaway children, in doing so, he loses the complete support base of his relationships in the family. It's all gone. He has nobody to turn to. He has no skill. He has no training. And he's vulnerable in a very wild, dangerous place. And then, of course, there's problems with this older son. The obedient son of the parable, the older one, as I said, is just as lost as his brother, but just in different ways. He separated himself, as I said a while ago, from his father's love by doing good things and by being a perfect model of obedience. His conduct, in and of itself, is fine. That's great. I mean, look at him. But his heart relationship with his father and his brother is all broken to pieces at the very beginning. As I said, in Middle Eastern culture of that day, the older son had certain responsibilities. Because of him being the eldest son, he held the position of being the mediator in any family crisis. It was his responsibility to fix things and make them right. Everybody knew that. Jesus knew that as he's telling this story to the people. The younger son, when he asked for his inheritance, the responsibility and the obligation of the older son was clear to everybody who's listening. Oh, that boy's asking for his inheritance. We know what the older brother's responsibility is. He needs to step in, intervene, and fix this. Stop it. He didn't do that. The father should have been told to leave the matter into the hands of the elder son because the younger boy doesn't really know what he's saying. He doesn't mean what he said. And, the request would break his father's heart. And the older son would have been going to the younger son, emphasizing this and saying, stop, you can't do this. We're going to get this fixed. We're not going to go. You're not going to break Dad's heart. You're not going to destroy our family. You're not going to break our family apart. I have this responsibility, and I'm committed to fulfilling that, and I'm not going to allow this to happen. He could have sought to bring reconciliation between the father and the rebellious younger brother. Instead, what did he do? He zipped his lip and waited silently for his share of the property and the family assets. He was just as wrong as his younger brother. And it even shows at the very conclusion of the parable, his way he talks to his dad. At the end of it, he is only viewing his father from a strictly commercial perspective. That's it. Dad's the banker, and I'm going to get what I can from him. I'm not going to be rebellious like my younger brother, but I'm going to get what I can out of Dad. He based his relationship with his father on money, what he could get out of him. He talks about his faithful service to his father. He reveals his real feelings, though, when he's talking to the father at the end, and sees him more as a boss to be obeyed or a banker to be respected. He's only interested in the money that he deserves as his reward because of his hard work. He doesn't love his dad, and he doesn't see his younger brother in trouble. And he doesn't care that his younger brother is in trouble. He's a greedy opportunist. And everybody knows that as Jesus is telling the story. They start putting all this together in their minds. He's silent. He shares guilt because of what happens, because he didn't reconcile. He did not act. They would have understood his obligation to mediate and fix things between the father and the younger brother. So he was scheduled as the older son to get twice as much as the younger brother, twice as much of the estate. The financial benefit of not doing anything was good for him, right? Hey, if I fix this, this doesn't happen. I don't get anything. I may die. I may die before Dad does. And I won't get nothing. So I'm just going to speak real quiet here. Let it just play out. And I'll get what comes to me, too. Rather than trying to put things back together. At the end of the story, he is in the courtyard with his dad, and he doesn't even address him as father. He doesn't even address him as with a title of honor at all. He's being very flippant with him. This son of yours. Notice how he says, this son of yours. He doesn't mention the fact of his brother, this relationship. He doesn't say any of that. He fails to acknowledge any kind of family ties with this younger brother. Wants nothing to do with him. He doesn't want the relationship restored and fixed. This son of yours, not my brother. So you've got a broken, fragmented relationship. And even at that time, for most of the people, they didn't consider God as an employer who paid a wage. But they did conceive of him in some respects as a father who desired a proper relationship with his children. Many people, common people, they weren't trying to serve God out of a sense of trying to get something out of God, but because they did love him. But the older son had a problem. The younger son had a problem. But guess who else had a problem in this story? And I'll close with this. Dad did. In every scene of the story, the father plays one major role: a loving, compassionate parent for both of his boys. One of the things he does, just like God does, he allows his sons the freedom of decision. He's not going to violate their will. You're free to choose what you want to do. I'm not going to force you to do anything. I'm not going to pressure you to do anything. Any relationship we have is not going to be because of me pressuring you or threatening you. Relationship we have, I want it to be based out of L-O-V-E, love, between us. So if you choose to do this, I'm not going to stop you. When they make the wrong choice that is destructive to them, and Father knows this, He's going to allow them to do it. But guess what? He's going to be waiting to help them when the crisis moment hits. The whole major role in this parable is played by Dad. He loves his sons enough to allow them the freedom to make their own decisions, even when they make the wrong ones. Any of us ever been in that boat? God allows us to make those choices. Sometimes the consequences that come with them are not good, but He's there waiting and willing to help. The audience who's listening, they're immediately making the connection. The Father here, he's God. They're making the connection between the two. They're putting it all together. This is God. They understood the compassionate, loving Father willing to help them. No parent can control the will of a child. No parent. Any of us who have been parents in here, we know that. You cannot control their will. Even as much as you want to, even as much as you know the choices they're making are going to be hurtful to them, you can't stop them. They make the choice and do it. And even if you can, when they're younger and you discipline them, they can still go in their room, shut the door, sit there, and still have a rebellious heart, even though you think you've got control over the situation. And in their heart, they're still just as stubborn and saying, if I had the chance, I'd do the same thing all over again. God isn't going to force His will on His children. He seems like He's a helpless father. And sometimes we look at God and we think, man, are you helpless? Look at all the stuff you're letting happen here. I don't understand. Why don't you do something? Why don't you stop these people from making these choices? But He doesn't. But here's the thing. Because He does love and because He's caring, He's always waiting and willing to help the children. The moment they wake up. He's not going to reject them. He's there waiting. He is seeking restoration. He is seeking healing of relationships. And neither one of those sons understands Him as a loving parent. They view Him from a financial standpoint strictly. He's a banker who has the money to take care of them and pay their wages. He receives everyone who comes to Him. Even if they make wrong choices, even if what they do brings disaster, He's ready to accept them back in the family when they come home. And again, there were stories like this, very familiar to the people that the rabbis had already been teaching. And Jesus is taking some of those things and He's taking them and He's turning and He's twisting them to push the people to see His Father in a different way. The Father is always going to receive His Son, even if He's done serious wrong and broken all the rules. And the Son must never have to worry about being ashamed to return to the Father. Jesus is reminding people of the nature of His Father, the need of each person to respond to God's expression of compassion to them and love, but also to forgive and accept the outcast. The older brother receiving the outcast younger brother and them being brought back together. The religious leaders, the tax collectors and sinners being brought back together as one people in the mercy and love of the Father. Problem with this dad is he's just too dad-burn good. He's just too kind. He's too gracious. He's too extravagant with His love toward sinners and rebels, and even toward the older legalistic ones too. All of the parables that Jesus tells, all of them view sin in this way. not as simply a breaking of a rule. No. In all the parables, when Jesus teaches about these things, they see sin as a broken line of fellowship and relationship. It's destroyed. It destroys it. And God is committed to bringing the relationships back together. So Jesus is acting out this drama for these people in 3 stories, but this one, the most famous of them all probably, to show them themselves. Remember, God is good. God is loving. God is gracious. God is forgiving. God is merciful. And I'll take a story and I'll put it beside it to shed light on those realities and show you just how good, kind, merciful, and loving and forgiving he is to both of you guys, to you tax collectors, to you sinners, to you religious leaders. He's that to you all. And he's going to push them over into a very uncomfortable place. That's what the parables are intended to do. And you'll notice when you come to the end of this parable, and we'll talk about this next week, there's no conclusion to it. It's left hanging. Because that's what parables do. They bring you to the point of decision, and then you have to choose. Where are you going to fit in the story? Who are you going to be in the story? And that's where he's going to leave the people at when he finishes with it. Father, thank you for being good. Thank you for being kind, loving, merciful, and gracious. Help us as we continue to go through this beautiful story about you to see how good, gracious, loving, kind, merciful, and how much joy you have in your heart toward every one of us. Everyone. Help us to see your extravagance, to receive it, to walk in it every day, and then to share that with other people. In Jesus' name.